Good morning, everybody. This is Mike Ungar. I am one of the founders for the Industry 4.0 Club, and this is our weekly Fireside Chat. This week we're hosting it on LinkedIn Live and streaming both along with LinkedIn Live to YouTube and to Twitter. This morning we're going to be joined by Jordan Hillstrom. We're going to talk about Industry 4.0 in the construction industry. So I'm really excited to get in that conversation. Before I do, though, I just wanted to mention that the Industry 4.0 Club holds weekly conversations, both on LinkedIn Live as well as on Clubhouse. Monday, we talk about women in manufacturing. Tuesday, we look at the future of Industry 4.0 in manufacturing, looking at technology. Wednesday is typically the Fireside Chat. And Thursday, we look at people, processes, and culture. All those conversations take place around the lunch hour. Today, as I said, we're joined by Jordan Hillstrom. Jordan is the Vice President of Business Development for Xeratec. Jordan, welcome. We're glad that you could join us today.
Yeah, thank you for the invite.
So, Jordan, just to get into the conversation a little bit, could you tell us a bit about yourself, and your background?
Sure. Yeah, I've been told recently I've got a very unique kind of blended background to why I'm here today. And, I grew up in the farming communities, just a very blue collar, rural childhood. And I joined the Army at a young age, ended up becoming part of the 75th Ranger Regiment. Did about 3 deployments and 5 years of service. Post-military, I went into law enforcement for a number of years. Got a degree in criminal justice and transportation logistics. And that really kind of started my career as where it's at today, kind of planted a lot of seeds to kind of how I operate and how I see the world. And I think that college experience kind of started to build the foundational building blocks of my role today and what I'm doing.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for your service, both in the military and also in law enforcement. So we appreciate that sacrifice that you and your family have made.
Thank you.
So I know you're part of Xeratec. Can you tell us a little bit about how Xeratec got started?
Sure. Yeah. So Xeratec's a multi-generational family-owned business. We're a software development firm, and we're in general full stack, agnostic to industry, which is really fun because we get to talk to a lot of different industry types, and it really makes our jobs fun. And we get to what I always kind of say is cross-pollinate best practices and help other industries kind of level up with other, like manufacturing is a good example, which we're going to talk in depth today about the bridge between. But the genesis really started my father about 24, 25 maybe years ago, probably actually longer now, was working for a manufacturing company and warehousing. And there was a lot of cataloging issues, a lot of inventory issues. There was really no computer systems at all at that time in warehousing. So he kind of started just tinkering around on some computers he begged, borrowed, and stole for his job. Literally, I was looking at some old books he had, and it was like how to program for dummies, like that elementary. No experience, but just started piecemealing things together to create a solution. Instead of having the Cardex system, they wanted to have a better process to manage inventory inbound and outbound. So when the powers that be asked what we have on hand, they can actually tell them. So that was kind of the first taste of seeing a problem and then identifying a viable solution. So that kind of spearheaded Steve Hillstrom, the founder of Xeratec, to create a solutions-oriented company like Xeratec.
Wow, that's fantastic. It's a lot of companies start just so you describe it in with the interest of solving someone's problem, and it sounds like that's exactly how Xeratec got started. When did you join them?
I've worked a couple of times for the company, different roles, but full time is probably about 5 years now. I've been with Xeratec, and that really started. If I could just throw this in there, I was working as a general manager and really a director of the trucking division of a construction company, and we started creating a SaaS product because we identified a problem in the industry, and we ended up partnering with Xeratec over 5 years ago now, and that kind of really led to my spot now. I realized I really enjoy working with software, and not just a software component, but how it affects everyday life. So I think I'm that bridge between both worlds.
So I know we're going to talk more and more about construction here in a minute. But so you actually have some construction industry experience. Can you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, I mean, I literally went from shoveling in ditches to, operating laser screeds, driving dump trucks on construction sites and, hauling material at small scale. So just a jack of all trades, and it was for the commercial construction industry. So a lot of concrete tilt type buildings down to, the excavating, grading, all the civil work, utilities. Kind of my background too, because we're in the army as an infantry grunt, you have to kind of be a jack of all trades to be successful. And so I went and just started picking up different, specialties like, fire marshal, water line inspector. So going through courses and getting certified to really understand the full picture of like when you start to plan these buildings and from connecting to city services to the building, there's a lot of different like basic uh, fundamentals that have to go into a application to make sure we have successful pressure and the longevity of these buildings and the infrastructure is sound. You have to have the adequate people in place. So at our company, we didn't really have that role. So I kind of started piecemealing a lot of the compliance components
Hmm.
into my kit bag, if you will.
Well, that's great. No, I appreciate you sharing more about that background. How did you get interested? I know Xeratec you mentioned is industry agnostic, but how did you guys get interested in Industry 4.0?
So I think that started really when I got my feet wet with construction in the SaaS environment, and we started looking at the trucking element of construction. When projects are starting 2, 3 weeks late because they don't have the base aggregates on the ground, the foundation can't even start, right? So I started looking at, like why is the industry doing the things they're doing? And it really started making me ask different questions. So as I joined the ranks of Xeratec and started working with more manufacturers, I was super intrigued with data and the questions that you're able to ask against the data sets you have. And I realized in the manufacturing space, there's way more, especially with IoT, IIoT, the advancement there. There's way more sensors on so many different lines that the data is just it's incredible. So if you know what you're looking for, the right questions to ask, it can paint a phenomenal picture. So I think that was just that. I hate status quo. Just it's always been this way. When you have data at your fingertips that you can make real life decisions to affect the bottom line, um, it really started to kind of open my eyes to what's possible.
Well, thank you. I just want to mention while Jordan and I are talking here that we certainly would invite those of you in the audience to come on, enter into our discussion with us. If you'll send me over LinkedIn messaging your email address, if you're interested in joining us, we'd be glad to send you the invitation and invite you to be part of this conversation. So um, we talked about construction industry 4.0, and you mentioned that the connection. Um, what are some of the challenges that you see today in the construction industry?
Well, I think if you went and rewinded maybe 8, 10 years, you're going to see a lot of technology emerging in the engineering space and the architectural and that whole world. But when it comes to the application and on the ground and actually the building process, from the again trucking into the materials to the building being erected, there's just a lot of delays and inefficiencies in processes, and I think a lot of that has to do with the lack of access to good technologies. Um, and again, too, I might be getting ahead of myself a little bit, but I feel that there's so many small technologies emerging now, but they're so competitive in nature. We don't stop long enough and really ask the question to the consumer base, to the market, and say the, what's going to make you successful, and then engineering a solution around that. I think there's a disconnect there.
Okay. Um, so you mentioned this disconnect. What other issues do you see with construction? In the construction, are there any functional areas that you see they're really struggling with, that they're really inefficient at, or where are the other some of the other challenges that construction leaders face today?
Sure. Yeah, and we can start with even just the transportation of material to start with. That's an area where we've spent a lot of energy, a lot of time, and there's a lot of conversations happening now. Trying to boil this down to very like elementary steps here. Um, to get the building started, right? We have foundation, we have the aggregates, the whatever we need to get that started, and it's honestly very simple. You have material, you have it at a quarry, at a rock pit somewhere. You got to get it from point A, then you have to get it to a job site. So you have the very basics of this. And we talked to hundreds of companies in the last 4 or 5 years, and almost everyone's like, we got a very complicated process. It's very difficult to explain. And if stop and think about it, it's so basic. You need a truck. You have to track the material for billing. You got to track the driver's pay for payroll and prevailing wage and all that kind of stuff. So even just getting the material flow from point A to point B and tracking that has been way overcomplicated because we're on a paper, carbon copy 6, 7 sheets deep. So there's just so many small delays and bottlenecks we've created with these archaic, antiquated processes that just to get material on site effectively is a challenge. And then a lot of that has to do with manpower as well. So we don't have data to plan accordingly or effectively. When we start these jobs, we're 2 or 3 weeks behind. So we're rushing to get material, and so it's always coming down a lot of times to a manpower and a resource allocation issue all of a sudden. So just to start with, we have a huge scheduling bottleneck on the front end of most projects.
And when you think about Industry 4.0, how might it help? How might the elements of Industry 4.0 help solve that sort of problem?
Sure. Yeah, I think access to material to start with. Just thinking about where do we get material from, the drive time to and from. So trying to drive down efficiencies there. Oftentimes, if we had the ability to communicate, and outside of a singular project, but as from the industry's perspective, if we know the next year we're going to move X amount of millions of cubic yards of said material into a certain area, we might consider alternative methods to get a lot of the bulk material in. Instead of individual trucks, maybe we can erect some kind of conveyor systems. But again, it's going back to that data saying over this next year, how many permits are being pulled? Can we start to say, based off where they're at, in a general sake, even how much material do we need? So really trying to go back to the data source and having a collective, bigger conversation about, we know we need this material. What's the most effective way to get it there? And as of right now, it's all on paper for the most part. So it's hard to really aggregate any kind of data and apply any kind of IoT principles and actually have something in these vehicles, in different quarry operations, to start pulling and asking questions of data, because it doesn't exist.
Well, that's interesting. So if I'm thinking, so you're really talking about then solutions to automate the information around the movement of product into the construction site.
That's definitely an area where I think is a worthwhile cause to start going after. And then you think about this: when any given job happens, it's the same type of materials that get moved around, and for every job, you have different companies that are going to fulfill that order. And oftentimes, we're fighting over getting drivers, and that's another area where if we could understand, we need material from point A to point B, instead of fighting with all these companies, what if there was a way to collaborate in a different manner to get the material there in a more effective manner? I think we're going to start to see the bottom lines don't actually decrease. They're probably going to increase because the efficiencies go up. And that's another area where if we can understand the bigger picture, it's going to allow us to understand how do we actually affect change there.
Well, that's interesting. When I think about Industry 4.0, there's so many different technologies that can be applied to a manufacturing site. So you've shared one particular area where we talk about the data aggregation in the movement of product. Are there other areas that you're hearing about from the construction industry that could use solutions that are today found in Industry 4.0?
Sure, that's a good question. One thing that I know we've worked with Xeratec on is the Samara laser screed, and I'm not sure if you ever watched one of these in operation, but they're a phenomenal machine. We're specifically working on what's called the 3D profile system. So any given area, you can say, I want 12 inches of cover for concrete, and you can build a 3D diagram or model of this terrain. And when the operations are happening, the screed knows where it's at on the pour site, and it could pour to the model that you're building. So you're effectively getting all the contour lines at a 12-inch offset or whatever that offset was set at. So that's some of the stuff that's effectively happening right now, and it's phenomenal, because what we're seeing in the industry is a lack of skilled workers entering the workforce. So there's as I heard recently, historically there was like a fire hose pouring skilled workers out into that trade. Now it's like, the spigot's been barely turned on, so it's just a trickle. So we're not getting enough skilled laborers through. So that's been one of the bottlenecks, is on these jobs, there's a lack of skilled workers to perform the services. So now with technologies, we're helping bridge that gap slowly. That's one area. So the laser screed being one, but now the laser screed connecting with, if we can communicate with other elements on the job site, for example, if we have graders out there, Caterpillar, a good example, they also used Trimble services. It's a site surveying tool. So if we could collaborate with the information that's being produced from the Trimble system, which Somro coincidentally uses that as well, if we could bridge the gap there even in a more effective manner, we could have the graders, the dozers, every other machinery type using the same kind of technology to pass information around. Because to me, it's when you're managing these job sites, there's all this information floating around, oftentimes with the more advanced companies anyways, but there's a lack of understanding how to use that data, one. So just, it's all isolated and autonomized. There's no real integration between. And that's been a huge issue when trying to plan these jobs effectively.
Well, that's interesting. So you shared a couple things there that I think really connect well with Industry 4.0. You shared maybe the concept of a digital twin almost when it comes to pouring concrete, where you've got a model of it offline, which allows you to do the work on the ground. Am I right in making that connection that way?
Correct. And I should have done a better job explaining like the ramifications of that. For instance, I only had a few years in the construction industry, and because I understand technology relatively well, I adapt quickly to that just based off my DNA probably. But I was able to jump on a laser screed and with a week of training, relatively proficient. Where historically it had taken months or years to get to where you could run to the same efficacy that I could in a week. So you're able to take less skilled people and make them more effective. That's kind of where I saw the immediate improvement to real time change there through technology.
One of the other things that you described a couple times now is the benefit of aggregating data through technology rather than on paper. I know in industry, when we do that, we're able to take the workers, instead of having them be data collectors, if you will, we turn them into helping us solve problems. Is that something that you also see possible in the construction industry?
Sure. And I kind of giggle at this because, think concrete pour again. It's oftentimes a wet, dirty, messy environment. And these dump truck operators, very skilled at that, actually back up in these tight spots and are pouring concrete. Typically, I always jump out of the truck and say hi as they're cleaning off their chutes, and they're handing off these pieces of paper, the carbon copy, right? Like the NCRs, whatever they're called. And you stack those somewhere, and oftentimes they blow around, or they get thrown to the truck somewhere. And inevitably, someone asks information like, "Hey, how many yards of concrete do you have on the ground today?" So like planning even like next 4 hours, like manpower, equipment, all these different small things that are real time impacts of the job. We don't have that access. We don't have information there. So the concrete companies producing this, they have the information, but it's back at headquarters typically. Every once in a while, you'll get a driver that'll radio on his CV and ask what our current yard count is or something like that. But even small things like that, because on paper we don't have real time information there in a lot of operations still.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation. So we've talked about digital twins and the idea where that concept can be applied in construction. We've also talked about the idea of turning the typical machine operator into someone who helps with problem solving. What other areas do you see as being good matches for the Industry 4.0 technology?
Well, I think just in general, I want to start and talk about going back to the origins of building and getting your precursors for concrete even, at the mining sites, and how do we extract the material out of the ground through the application on the job site. There's so many different touch points that has, and right now where I see the biggest problems in the industry is there's a couple big players as far as technology, and they've kind of monopolized a lot of the industry. And the problem that I see is I talk to so many people. They're like, I like the idea of this, but it's not practical. It doesn't work. So they'll have all these bells and whistles that aren't functional to help them do their job. So there's just a breakdown of what the companies are able to use in technology right now. And again, I alluded to this earlier, is there's a ton of small technology firms. Like we have a product called Load Tracks, and it's meant for short haul automation for dump trucks. But we're just one small tool in a huge ecosystem. And we're not a big enough player yet to affect change, by ourselves here. So I think what I want to see, where technology and some of these Industry 4.0 applications could come in handy, is if we can create a technology. I think there's a word or term that, kind of an integrator, if you will, in the Industry 4.0 in manufacturing, where all these bigger players, these bigger voices, in a non-competitive manner, are coming to the surface and saying, "Hey, how can we help increase efficiencies, improve the livelihoods of people on the job here, and make our companies better, faster, smarter?" And then really the end goal is to make a better product faster for the consumer, taking consumer feedback and then recreating that again, right? So we're in construction. I don't feel there's an integrator happening necessarily, so it's very competitive in nature. And so from the start where we get the material from the mining all the way through the application of the building, if we had the ability to communicate through technologies at every end user level, I feel like technology could be exploited or leveraged in a lot more effective and smart manner. I know I kind of jumped around there a little bit, but I think there's definitely some lessons we could learn from what's already happening in manufacturing, Industry 4.0 clubs, even like this.
Yeah, you mentioned we were talking a little bit offline about the fact that there's a lack of integrators for the construction industry. One of the things we've learned in manufacturing is that, especially for small and mid-sized manufacturers who don't have the internal resources, is that an integrator can be a really, really important catalyst for effective implementation of the Industry 4.0. And it's not about, the tool there. It's about how do I take the tool, integrate it well into the process, and get the results I'm looking for. So I think what I heard you say is that that's maybe a gap in construction right now.
It is. There's a lot of duplication of efforts happening in a lot of regards. Go to any construction site right now, and you're likely going to see an idle truck or two. They're just going to be sitting there. A lot of times their engines are running. They're waiting for their orders because they're just stuck to the process. And I'll try to explain this by saying, because we have lack of insight to how to actually effectively manage our jobs, a lot of times we don't know when exactly we'll need these trucks. But if I don't kind of hoard them, I'll lose them today because another company's going to need them. We'll push them somewhere else. But I know in a pinch, I'm going to need them. So that's an area where if we had the ability to forecast a little better with data, with true on-the-job daily data, not 2 weeks removed, we'll be able to start driving our decisions based off, the access to data, and we won't have as many bottlenecks like that. So, and the why I think this is could be a benefit, taking some of these things that we're learning from manufacturing, is if I could plan my day out or 2 weeks out based off historical data, where we're at in the job site, which station we're at, kind of, if you will. We know exactly what resources we need and when. So all of a sudden, we don't have to, hoard our resources and kind of fight even internally. I've watched companies internally from one job to the next fighting over resources. And a lot of it has to do with the lack of planning. And the planning comes from a lack of insight and lack of data. So that's an area where I feel there's a huge disconnect as well.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Maybe I could pause for a second. I just want to mention to our audience, this is the Industry 4.0 Club. This is our weekly Fireside Chat today. Today we're talking with Jordan Hillstrom, the Vice President for Business Development for Xeratec. And we're talking about the application of Industry 4.0 tools, technologies, and approach in the construction industry. So if you'd like to join our conversation, we'd love to have you join us. Please drop me your email address on LinkedIn messaging, and we'll be glad to invite you to join us here and engage with Jordan in talking about this topic in the construction industry. Jordan, I was thinking about something else. You know that I spent many years working for Michelin North America, and one of the things that Michelin does is produces these large tires for mining, and these big mines, where that mine raw materials, the trucks are actually driven autonomously and controlled that way. And there's lots of sensors on the tires because they're so expensive. Is that application something that you see that could be possible in many construction sites as well?
I do, and I think we're already seeing them actually at a smaller level playing out. And I do think the larger players are already looking at some of that stuff. The unfortunate part is the majority of construction sites aren't always operated by those companies that can afford that kind of technology. But yeah, just in a vacuum, that's definitely an application I see being pushed more and more. Especially as we're able to take, like you take a drone and you start to fly over this site and map it out and put a lot of parameters on this site. So you build in these models to where we want to move material and when. So there's a sequence that we're going to be building it. Before we get too much equipment on the site, it's a lot easier. But once you start getting a lot of different, um, you know, the footprint of the building starts to happen, you get the foundations poured or other utilities start to put in. It's a little bit harder because there's so many different factors that are hard to kind of prove out through these modeling that they have currently. But yeah, I do think the future is going to be a lot more of the autonomous driven machinery. And you're already seeing it even in, excavators and a lot of other systems. I know most manufacturers are producing nowadays. There's not a lot of manual input needed anymore. They'll always typically right now have operators in them, but the work that's being done is so precise based off some of these different 3D modeling systems that are out there.
Yeah, that's interesting. There are technology companies today developing more and more precise positioning technology. And it's interesting because I would have said to you 20 years ago in our tire plants that I never could imagine an automated guided vehicle because we we're dealing with a natural product. We have issues with our equipment. Our uptime wasn't good enough, and there wasn't anything routine. But in fact, the reality is, the more reliable the process, the more predictable the process, the easier it is to automate. And I'm wondering, in a construction site, are there a lot of interruptions or things that stop the routine, or is it fairly stable where you can actually bring sort of planned technology to the table?
That's a great question, and that's one thing that I think is getting better. But if and I want to give credit where credit is due, it's a lot different animal from construction to manufacturing. In most scenarios, there's such a disparity between the controlled environment and the manufacturing center versus construction. One day you're going to have clear blue skies. Next day you have 4 inches of slopping down rain, and you can barely see what you're doing, below your feet, just because it can get nasty out there. So I think part of it is just sheer environmental factors to be able to understand what the best way to utilize technology when, and stuff hits the fan, if you will. Well, what do we do next? We have to rely on our, fundamentals again. So I think just at its core concept, on its face value, it's definitely different to apply a good technology throughout without a human interaction there. Walk through. I did a tour of BMW manufacturing center in the Greer, I think it's Spartanburg, South Carolina, and just amazed at how clean that place was, and how much aid was given to the workers that did do the work. Even so, you have all the machining and the robotics, but then even where the human interaction with the vehicle took place, the ergonomic assist and the lifting of batteries with robotics with the aid of a human. So there are, the human factor still involved, but even there, they've tried to eliminate a lot of the factors of how humans can get hurt and where the inefficiencies are in the human factor. So I'm hoping we take some of that example. So when the environmental factors are affecting the technology, how can we assist the human at doing their job? One example of this that I used at I think it was some kind of conference, ConEg, I think it was a couple of years ago in Vegas. There was these like VR glasses I put on, and for pre-planning through execution of the project, literally every week they want to, in theory, I don't think they're this advanced yet, but they want to be able to see the job, what was going to be done that day or that week before it was done. So from placing material to, excavation to utility placement to all these different factors, they want to be able to identify the process we're going to do it in, and then how it's actually going to be executed. So stuff like that in a sterile environment, vacuum is great. But then again, when you get the environmental factors that are, out of our control, what do you do next?
That's good. I'm starting to get a better picture of how all this could be applied. It's interesting when you mentioned the cost earlier, maybe prohibitive for a lot of these companies. One of the things that's made Industry 4.0 so more of a must for manufacturers is that the cost of doing this has come down rather dramatically in the last few years. What are some of the barriers that you see? Why aren't construction in companies pulling on this more aggressively? Because I know in manufacturing, for the longest time, it was ROI and cost. But with the reduction in cost, their ROIs are much improved. Is it the same issue for the construction industry, or what are the other barriers that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think, give it 20 years. I think it'll be pretty standard for a lot of these different technologies honestly, a lot of them they exist. There's a lot of amazing technologies. I've gone to a couple of conferences in the last, 4 or 5 years, and the things that we're seeing are amazing. But the cost, again, is a huge barrier for most smaller companies. And then two, I think there's a broken mindset. And again, I could be coming at this like a bull in a china closet. So I guess I'll say by saying, trying to respect prior generations and how they operate. There's a lot of nuances to construction I don't understand. I probably never will. So I want to respect those that have started their companies 30, 40, 50 years ago or longer, yet always kind of pushing the status quo. And you so often hear this, well, it's not broke, or we've always done it this way. So there's this really old school, limbic brain thinking, like, I'm not changing because it works. My grandpa and great grandpa and so on and so forth have done it that way. So I think it's really this lack of growth mindset, or the desire, willingness to change maybe. So a lot of times there is the financial means to do it, but there's just a lack of appetite to want to take this new technology and adopt it.
Yeah, that's a great point. Change management in manufacturing is so key to making an industry 4.0 successful. If you aren't able to really solve a problem that's for the worker on the shop floor, the likelihood of them really embracing the technology is limited. Okay, so starting with what are the issues for the actual on the ground construction worker, helping to use this technology to help them address that problem, making their jobs easier is usually one of the first ways, at least that when we talk about how do we get started, that we find, at least in manufacturing, getting started to implement this sort of technology. Would that sort of same thing work in construction?
I think so. I really do. And I think going back, and I think you actually coached me in this a long time ago, and it's a very, pretty basic military principle of, mission first, men always. If we can apply basic principles like that to leadership using technology to say, what's the bottleneck today for my guys? What's causing them to not be as efficient as they potentially could be? And I know you'd have other talks about, people and processes. But I think of even cold days when you have guys out there that's very manual labor, heavy. If it's cold and rainy, very basic principles like a nice raincoat, good warm boots, keeping your men and women effectively equipped to do the job that they're supposed to do helps efficiencies. And that's something that's not new. It's not radical, but even stuff like that, so often you see lacking on a lot of job sites. So I guess, yeah, starting there and trying to understand what's really going to effectively help on the ground employees, to me, I think help shift, because if you get more productivity and efficiencies out of your people with technology at small scale, it's easier over time to start to see, okay, well, I don't maybe get it and want to use it, but it's helping them. So I think there's definitely that we can start at a very elementary level, if that makes sense.
No, it does. I think that's always, this idea of change management. Oftentimes when you are aware, as we've talked a lot now about the technologies that are possible to put in place, it's usually change management and helping individuals see the vision and helping them understand how this can help them, rather than, oh my gosh, it's something that's scary and I don't, because I don't understand it, I'm not going to do it. That's usually the best way to get it started. So I think that's fair. And you're exactly right. Focusing on the individual, how can we make their job easier? Is usually the first way where they get introduced to the technology, and then their comfort begins to grow. The technology is not actually something they need to be afraid of, but something that can help them.
I totally agree. I think one of the areas where I think using Industry 4.0 thought process around, like, safety, for instance, so often in the construction industry, they look at safety as a necessary evil, but safety really should be like a culture, a way of life. And it's not like this cliche saying. It's, if we cared about our people, we'd focus on that first. And the safer we are, in theory, the ROI and the jobs are more profitable, less downtime, less injuries, just all these negative byproducts of not having a safe culture. So oftentimes, if we, starting back again, because there's a disconnect from, the estimating software we use through, we're executing the job itself. So if we don't estimate correctly, we're trying to cut corners to make our, whatever bid we set this job out to be. From day one, we're fighting that estimate. So now if we're behind, we go on to we're digging trenches for utilities, and it takes an extra day, for instance, to put a trench box in there. I got to rent it or go get one from the shop, got to put it in there, erect it, put it together, and I got to move it along. It's a lot slower. So I've watched this. I've watched them at different companies. It's just one ditch, it's one trench, right? So again, I think if we could start with technology at the front end to effectively do our jobs, to set the job up for success, it changes the entire narrative of the job. So really, it starts a negative ripple effect often because the front end is already set up for failure.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So I just wanted to, again, invite our audience if they would come and join us in the conversation. We'd be happy to have you be part of the discussion we have here going with Jordan Hillstrom. He's the Vice President for Business Development for Xeratec. We're talking about the application of Industry 4.0 in the construction business. So Jordan, I'll just take a second and kind of come back to touch on a lot of points here, see if we've missed anything in our conversation so far. So we talked about digital twins initially, and how that can help really plan for and be more precise in our work on the construction site. You mentioned the example of pouring concrete as an example there. We talked about data aggregation and using that to better understand what's going on instead of using it in a manual way, using that through digital approach so that we can see the construction site, see what's happening on a real-time basis. We touched on the idea that autonomous vehicles, how can they be better applied in a construction site? Certainly that works best when maybe it's a repetitive task, but even if it's not, having, just like we see with drones today, having those driven remotely can be a big plus. We look at sensors, sensors on those vehicles to know when they're having issues so they don't break down. So we have a good reliability of our equipment. We talked about the idea of robots helping construction workers, maybe improving ergonomics with them so that they don't have to do the hard tasks. But again, that works best with repetitive tasks, obviously. And we also talked about modeling. You mentioned ergo improvements, and you mentioned safety, using technology to help improve safety. Are there any of the thoughts you've got on where there are particular challenges in construction where Industry 4.0 could be applied? Anything else come to mind?
Yeah, maybe I'll start and maybe flip the script and ask you a couple of questions, because I think there's still lessons that we have to learn in manufacturing space, like some of the smaller operations that could apply the exact same principles, but there's a cost as a barrier to entry, right? And I feel that, again, going back to some of these larger companies that have adopted some awesome, amazing technologies at scale that are running very lean and effective, that's great. But they've got the capital, the resources to do so. Most companies, again, there's definitely a old school mentality a lot of times. So taking these technologies and making it actually pragmatic to where the end user, the consumer, and most construction elements can actually adopt this. To me, it might be just a matter of time as costs come down, as more people slowly adopt it in the marketplace. Just that natural evolution will have to take place, really. But to me, that's the biggest disparity is the average operation won't or probably can't afford to invest in this technology, for the next 5 to 7 years, likely until it's almost a mandate on the jobs based off the general contractors or how it's being built. There's likely going to be some compliance components, kind of been a huge push oftentimes for some of these to be effectively adopted. But yeah, I think the cost barrier has been one of the biggest things for making these technologies to an everyday common occurrence on these job sites.
Yeah, it's interesting because that was I'll use the word, the excuse used in manufacturing for a long time. And now we're seeing that even small to mid-size, and you have to have a clear problem to solve with an ROI. So it's not just technology for technology's sake, but it's hey, I've got this problem. I have this cost, and I want to improve the operation. And so based on the investment in the technology, I get this ROI, a good change management plan, and boom, we have a win. We have something that's making life better for both the worker and better bottom line results for the company. And I think we need to try to find those things in construction in much the same way. Where can we start? What problem is it that's most aggravated for the operator, for the worker on the site? And then how can we apply technology to address that? I think that's the same way I would approach a manufacturing site would be the same way I might consider approaching a construction site.
That's a good point. I think one thing, again, I think it goes back to the integrators, the players that are looking across the spectrum that aren't always just out for their own company and their own gains, to bridge the gap from what's happening on the ground to how to make it better for the entire industry. And there are some players doing this in the space. I've talked to a few in the last couple of months. Sat down with a company out of Tennessee, the BuildWit team. They started as a media agency, and I'm watching their shift. That really focusing on how do we make this world a better place, the dirt world specifically a better place. So they're looking at very pragmatic approaches of, okay, let's train our leaders better. Let's make our leaders more effective. Let's make our people more effective and celebrate culture. So those are the small shifts that are happening. They're also looking at technology. How do we affect technology with all this being done at the same time? And, there's some of our competitors for load tracks, like Dauber being one of them, and I think it's called Whitney Transport out of Florida. Like these companies starting to see like they can't do it on their own. So I think the next 6 months, next year, I'm really hopeful that some of these bigger thinkers that do believe that if we could collaborate at a higher level than just a profit margin conversation, we're not just competitors. We have to collaborate to make this happen. That's where I am really hopeful that we can learn from guys like you you are one of those integrators. You are thinking bigger. But you've also been through almost every role at Michelin, as I understand, over 30 something years in many countries. You've had the ability to kind of see different elements of what works and what doesn't work. And that's what we need is more industry experts that are willing to invest and pour back into the industry.
Well, that's great. Well, I think we're reaching the end of our time today. We've certainly had a great conversation about how Industry 4.0 can support and help the construction industry and where it can really help build better business results. And as you said, not only take care of the worker, but also take care of the company as well. Do you have any parting thoughts? Shots maybe as well, but parting thoughts as we get ready to finish the conversation this afternoon?
Well, I guess the one question I have is you talked about some of the excuses that you had observed, and I guess I wonder even right now, we work with some manufacturers that are relatively antiquated when it comes to technology and a lot of legacy systems that are being used. Where do you see the adoption for some of these smaller operations and some of the smaller players, if you will, but very vital and important regardless? Kind of in your experience in the industry, the manufacturing space you've been in, how do we see us bridging that gap, or was that just a natural evolution that's going to have to play out, or what's your thoughts there?
Well, I think you start with the customer. All right. So you ask the question, where's my pain point in serving the customer? All right. I think we start with that question, or where's my pain point for my workforce and their ability to do that? And I think if you start with answering that question, then you start asking the question, how can we fix that issue? Okay. Using the tools and technology that's available today. So there's no silver bullet about always start here, always start there. The issue is really understanding the company, understanding the pain point with the customer. Again, whether that's directly from the customer or from the workforce serving the customer. And for me, that's where you start, because that's where you end up with the likelihood that when you solve it for everybody inside the company, they see the benefit, both on the bottom line and the workforce. They embrace the technology, and one victory can then lead to another. So for me, that's how you get started. So if you invited me to a construction site, I would try to understand, what is it we need to do to meet the requirements of the job where we're having trouble, and going out to talk to the folks working on the site to say, where are your biggest challenges, and try to find the sweet spot in there, and then looking for a solution there. I think that's how you get started, because again, once you can solve a problem that everybody sees as a real issue in serving the customer or in the employees working to serve the customer, then I think you're on your way.
No, that's a great point. I think, in closing, I guess I would say with that comment in mind is so often from mid-level managers on up in most construction companies, if you talk to them for more than 5 minutes, they're going to tell you that they're putting out fires, something to that effect, right? And if, again, you were to stop and do some root cause analysis, you're going to find out there's some phenomenal technologies likely, or a better process, maybe to start there, even very simplistic. Um, we change the way we operate. Likely those fires we're putting out aren't fires to start with. So I think that's where I really want to see, again, us really leaning into the manufacturing space, learn from the mistakes made and learning how we adopt better, more effectively. But ultimately is ask the right questions. Because if you do, I think starting again, like you said, ask the right questions and you're going to get some interesting answers. But again, to aggregating that data to help then provide solutions. And that's where I'm really hopeful that we can understand some of the problems from a very elementary basic level to where we can actually start very small micro levels to make this transition over the next 5 to 10 years that I'm really hopeful that we'll see some big changes.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good observation. So as we reach close here, I want to just to let everybody know that this has been the Industry 4.0 Club Fireside Chat. We've been talking this afternoon with Jordan Hillstrom, who's the Vice President for Business Development for Xeratec. The Industry 4.0 Club has rooms weekly on Clubhouse and here on LinkedIn Live, as well as broadcasted to YouTube and Twitter. Mondays at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time, we have a conversation about women in manufacturing, focused on a topic related to business. On Tuesdays, we host a room on the future of manufacturing focused on technology. Wednesdays at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm sorry, at 11:30. I mixed it up there. 12:30 p.m. for Monday, 12:30 p.m. for Tuesday. Wednesday is 11:30 a.m. for the Fireside Chat. And then Thursday at 12:30 p.m., we do a people process and or a culture conversation focused, again, on Industry 4.0. So we really appreciate, Jordan, you taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk with us today. And if you like this conversation, please follow us on LinkedIn, on our website, Industry 4.0 Club. And we look forward to seeing you join us next week. Thanks, Jordan, for your time.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Appreciate it.